The family of former Vice President Dick Cheney released the following statement. Richard B. Cheney, the 46th Vice President of the United States, died last night, November 3rd, 2025. He was 84 years old. His beloved wife of 61 years, Lynn, his daughters Liz and Mary, and other family members were with him as he passed. The former vice president died due to complications of pneumonia and cardiac and vascular disease. For decades, Dick Cheney served our nation, including as White House Chief of Staff, Wyoming's Congressman, Secretary of Defense, and Vice President of the United States. Dick Cheney was a great and good man who taught his children and grandchildren to love our country and to live lives of courage, honor, love, kindness, and fly fishing. We are grateful beyond measure for all Dick Cheney did for our country, and we are blessed beyond measure to have loved and been loved by this noble giant of a man. Dick Cheney has passed away.
He lived this life really in three acts. This public life, the first was, and we were talking about this off camera, Willie. The first act was as actually sort of seen as a moderate, highly respected voice in Congress as a minority whip. There's a point in David Stockman's book where they were talking about the Reagan Revolution and the cuts they were making, and they kept pushing forward. And then at one point, he said, Dick Cheney just quietly said in the room, "That's enough. Can't go any further." And David Stockman said, with a man this respected, a voice, this large in Congress, we knew we had pushed the outer boundaries. Then, of course, post 9/11, he was seen as Darth Vader, called Darth Vader by many people because he supported what I think a lot of Americans supported, what was called the 1% solution. And he was determined, Dick Cheney was determined, from that moment on, after 9/11, there would never be another 9/11 again. And he was going to do whatever he could to stop it. And we'll talk to Jim Vandehei about this in a minute, but he also is seeing reports day in and day out that would have scared the absolute hell out of any American that had access to all the threats we're here. And then finally, the third act, of course, one of these Republicans, that we're seen as a defender of democracy. When so many others lost their way, Dick Cheney kept his bearings after January the 6th, always kept his bearings when it came to democratic norms. And he was on the right side. I think most, certainly Republicans from my era, would believe. And I think we all should be grateful to him for that.
One of his last public acts was about a year ago when he put out a statement saying, "I'm going to be voting for Kamala Harris in this presidential election." Dick Cheney, Darth Vader, as you said, the face of the Republican Party in many ways in the Bush years, said Donald Trump can never be trusted with power again, appearing with his daughter Liz Cheney, of course, who was one of the most outspoken voices against the Trump administration. He actually, if you go back even further, was the chief of staff to Gerald Ford, then ran for Congress, where he served for 10 years, Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush during the Gulf War, then went and became the CEO of Halliburton, and then, of course, the years that many people remember post 9/11, Jim. He was a supporter of the invasion of Iraq, which turned out to be on faulty intelligence. Also supported the enhanced interrogation techniques, torture of enemy combatants, and all of that. So that is most certainly a big part of his legacy, but there was a lot more to the man.
I mean, we've all been doing this a long time. I've been doing it 30 years. He's by far and away the smartest thinker about the mechanics of government that I've ever met, and it's not close. I was lucky that I interviewed him several times. I went with him to Auschwitz when he went there, and then after the presidency, we would go out and see him occasionally at his house because he knew everything. He knew every lever of government because you just walked through his resume. He understood how Congress worked. He understood how the bureaucracy worked. He understood, he had all these relationships, even post-presidency, with all these world leaders. He just understood power. And there's times where people hated him, a lot of people loved him, but he was also like, he was his own man, right? Like when he came out post 9/11, people don't realize the reports that he and President Bush were getting in those days after 9/11. And it really turned him dark. It made him feel like we can never let this happen again. He was willing to do things other people weren't willing to do. He got a hell of a lot of criticism for that. And what he would say is like that was like a very principled view based on the threat matrix that he was seeing. And then right before his death, the idea that Dick Cheney would be leading the Republican charge against the president, an elected president, and the leading nominee would have been unthinkable. He was a party guy, but he was a principled guy, and he understood the Constitution, he understood history, and he understood, in his mind, he felt like there was a legitimate threat to it.
Yeah, and he would say, Jonathan Lemire, about the post 9/11 record, he would say, how many attacks did we get after 9/11? That was my goal, he would say. And you can look and see the number of Americans, more than half of America believed more attacks were coming, and they would come in successive waves against us. There was such shock. So again, he would say, look at the record, look what happened. We didn't get attacked again. There was, of course, the Iraq War, which I actually believe will probably be, when the obituaries are written, there will be talk of, again, all three chapters of his life. The first and the third is protector of democracy. But in that second, I think as much as the war on terror, which many people would consider to be a success, the blind spot was going into Iraq.
Yeah, and those two things sort of became linked in the public narrative, the war on terror, of course, and then Iraq, because the administration did that. So it is hard to prove in some ways, look, we've stopped these terror attacks because so much of it was classified, you can't reveal it. It's hard to come out with that success story. It's much easier to see the visible failure, and the justification of the Iraq war and what it led to was certainly a failure for Vice President Cheney. We should just note for the viewers, that was the text I had received in case you were wondering if there was something else coming. We just wanted to confirm this. No, because I've heard from people like, what's going on? So I was like, this is what it is. Right. We wanted to run it through normal channels before we went with it on air. But we should also note, to your point a moment ago, it's because he was seen as the power behind the throne, the architect of the Bush administration, Darth Vader. So, and I would argue, the most disliked politician by Democrats we have had in decades until Donald Trump. That's why his endorsement to come out against Donald Trump, not just say, I'm going to sit this race out, like I'm not going to vote for Trump, but to come out the other way and back a Democrat and Vice President Harris, it was, to a lot of people, very meaningful.
But what is the through line on all of those things? Dick Cheney did what he thought was best for America. Politics be damned. Whether he did it as a highly respected member of the House, minority leadership, whether he did it as Secretary of Defense, also something that will be seen as a very positive chapter in his life that a lot of people forget during the first Iraq War. First Gulf War, whether he'll be remembered as Vice President for the ups and downs of that, or whether he'll be remembered as by many of the people who loathed him before. As a defender of democracy. And this happens. Mika's father was loathed by progressives in the Democratic Party. Ed Alou said he was booed at the Democratic National Convention because he took such a hard line against the Soviet Union. And then, after the Iraq War, suddenly every liberal loved him. The two things, I will say, the two things, and I don't think your dad would mind me saying this, the two things these two men shared in common is they really didn't give a damn what the New York Times or Wall Street Journal editorial page said about them. They were going to do what they thought their duty was to America.
And we live near each other in McLean, Virginia.
And also, two guys with enormously big brains. I actually go back to what Jim said a second ago, which is if you really think about the arc of the career, this to me is the core of it. When he goes to his first job in politics is working for Don Rumsfeld in 1969. Okay, he's 28 years old.
That's a tough job for him.
My brother worked for Rumsfeld.
He goes into the White House as an intern at 28.
Yeah.
And 6 years later, having never left the White House. He's Gerald Ford's chief of staff. White House chief of staff, arguably like the most powerful job in America besides president.
Right.
At the age of 34, okay? That is a prodigy in terms of the understanding of how power works. Before he even went to Congress, he already had operated at the very highest levels of federal power, and that the kind of apprenticeship, the fact that he was a student of power and the dynamics of power and how Washington works on both sides from Capitol Hill to the White House and then over to in the agencies, just gave him a 360 view of how modern Washington worked and how how power flowed in that city and how to work the levers behind the scenes. That's, I think, as much as anything, the definitive thing about it. A brilliant guy who really understood power in Washington like almost no one else ever has.
Just having a sense of a moment like this, what it's like. My thoughts are with Liz, Mary, and Lynn right now and what they must be going through.